Hey everybody, this is going to be our first lecture in our new unit on comic books. We're going to talk about the rise of the comic book industry. We're going to go back to the Great Depression and talk about how the rise of comic books fit within the context of Great Depression era America. And then we're going to talk about the birth of the superhero and some of the early stars of comic books, like this fella right here, Superman. All right, so let's get into this. Historians talk about different types of sources, primary sources and secondary sources in particular. A primary source is some sort of account or document from the period of time under study. A secondary source is some sort of later analysis or synthesis of that information. So, for example, a good example of a secondary source is the book we're reading for this unit, Brad Wright's Comic Book Nation. But comic books themselves can serve as a really interesting primary source for history. Documents from the period of time that we're interested in studying. Comic books offer an interesting avenue to investigate history, an interesting angle for these kinds of things. For example, one of the interesting things about comic books is it gives us some interesting insight into youth culture. The target audience for comic books, up until relatively recently. In more recent years, the demographic for comic books has skewed older and older. But originally, comic books were for kids, were for adolescents. And so it gives an insight into that sort of target audience. But also, comic book writers and artists often weren't much older than the readers initially. In the beginning of the industry, comic book writer or artist was generally not something that most of these people aspired to. It was the beginning step to a more serious career in either art or publishing. It's where you started back in the day and you hope to move beyond for many of these people. And so often comic book artists and writers were quite young. And so the history of comic books gives us interesting insight into youth culture. And we'll talk about this more also later on. But also, comic books give us a really interesting perspective into fringe culture. Unlike so many other aspects of popular culture, comic books didn't cost a lot of money to make or produce. You can make one-off comic books and then print up a relative low volume of copies and distribute them locally or nationally for not a lot of money. Compare that to making a movie, or compare that to creating a television show. Those things cost enormous amounts of money to make and distribute. But comic books were far less, cost far less money to produce. And because of that, there were fewer gatekeepers determining what was going to get produced and how it was going to get produced. So you could get some really weird, oddball stuff in comic books that, generally speaking, you just couldn't get on network television back in the day. Didn't work like that. So comic books are going to give us a really interesting perspective on history. We're going to mostly be talking about the period from the 1930s into the 1970s. And comic books give us a really interesting perspective on things like the Great Depression and World War II, post-World War II American society, the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement, the rise of feminism. We're going to talk about a lot of these traditional things we would normally talk about in a history or American studies class, but we're going to do it from this really interesting lens of comic books. So let's start talking about that. Let's talk about the rise of the industry. Okay. We're really talking about the 1930s when we talk about the rise of the comic book industry. There were examples of comic book-like writing prior to that, but it's really the middle, late 30s where the comic book industry takes birth. And Brad Wright in your book talks about thinking of comic books in the modern form as a combination of two other areas of popular culture. One was the comic strip. Before you had comic books, you had comic strips that appeared in newspapers and took the form that we would come to understand in later comic books, of characters in cells with little dialogue bubbles or boxes where we would get dialogue in there. So if you take the look of the comic strip and you put it into paperback or book form, you get one half of this equation. But almost more importantly, Wright argues, was the storytelling from pulp fiction, or penny dreadfuls, as they were sometimes referred to. The end of the 1800s, beginning of the 20th century, the price of producing books dropped dramatically because of advances in production, particularly the introduction of very cheap paper made from pulp. This is where part of the name pulp fiction comes from, this new style of paper that became much cheaper to produce. And because the price of these books came down, you got a whole new kind of genre of writing of kind of disposable books that were written quickly, that were intended for mass audiences, that didn't have aspirations of art or fine literature, but rather almost kind of like disposable junk that was supposed to be fun and entertaining, that you would read and then, whatever. Keep on a shelf maybe, give to somebody else, or just, throw away at some point. These books were very cheaply made. That accounted for their inexpensive nature. So they tended to disintegrate fairly quickly. They didn't last very long, but that was part of the virtue of them. They were cheap to make. And so you got this whole new genre of writing that focused on the titillating, the violent, the strange, the weird, that comes to be known as pulp fiction or penny dreadfuls that you get. Weird storytelling, stories filled with sex and violence that were supposed to intrigue the reader, but not necessarily elevate your perspective on life. Wright tells us that comic books are going to be inspired in terms of their storytelling from this tradition of pulp fiction, where you're going to get stories filled with violence, stories sometimes filled with sexual titillation, stories that didn't aspire to art. But as we'll talk about, as time goes on, some people, even though they might not have originally been intended as art, some people would argue that some of these comic books were in fact artful. Talk about that later on as we go. And so that's, by the time you get to the middle to the late 1930s, there are comic book publishers putting out these small booklets that look like material from comic strips that came in newspapers, but were filled with storytelling that was more adventurous. Newspapers were and are supposed to be respectable sort of things. So there was a limit to how far you could go with newspapers in terms of how wild your stories could be. But in these standalone paperback versions, these comic books, things could get really wild. Again, that's one of the things that's so intriguing and different about comic books. The low production cost and distribution cost of comic books meant you could get some really wild stuff in there. And in fact, we'll talk about this a lot more later on, precisely when criticism starts to develop against comic books, particularly in the 1950s, where some adults start paying attention to the wild stuff that was in these comic books and really start to freak out. And we'll get there, and it's an interesting storyline. Let's talk about the first truly great star of comic books, and that was Superman. Superman was the first superhero. Now, we've all grown up in a world where the idea of superpowered creatures that can do things like fly and melt things with their eyes and wear capes and have alternate identities is a very common thing. But Superman was the first of this sort. He was the first superhero. Really a new hero for the 20th century. Superman was the invention of these two high school kids from Cleveland, Ohio, Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel. And their aspiration, their idea for Superman was to get Superman into the newspapers. There was more money in newspaper comics than there was early on in comic books. In the comic strips in newspapers, you could get a syndicated, reoccurring storyline where you produce something for newspapers around the United States, even internationally, potentially, and reoccurring. It comes once a week, 2 times a week, 5 times a week in the newspaper, in newspapers all around the United States. That was potentially big money. That was potentially long-term big money. Early on with comic books, there just wasn't that kind of money for the artists and the writers of these comic books. And so Siegel and Shuster first wanted to get Superman into the comic strips. But the problem was, Superman was so damn weird for the newspapers. Again, we're used to the idea of freakishly powerful creatures. Sometimes they're aliens, sometimes they're mutants that can do all these weird things. But imagine a middle-aged newspaper editor or newspaper owner who is getting pitched the idea of Superman, an alien with superpowers. And these two young men want to pitch this idea to you and put it into your newspaper. It was just too damn weird for the newspapers. And so finally, Siegel and Shuster, realizing that this was just too hard of a pitch for the newspapers, started to shop this around to some of the new comic book publishers. And it eventually landed at a new comic book publisher that had a line known as Detective Comics, or what we better know it as now, DC Comics. And someone at DC saw the potential for Superman, and they were creating a new comic book called Action Comics. And there was so much enthusiasm at DC for Superman that they not only bought the rights to Superman, but put Superman on the cover. This is Action Comic number 1. And it didn't just contain the Superman comic. There were other stories in there, which was common early on with comic books. But they saw enough potential, DC, to put Superman on the cover of it. If you have a clean copy of Action Comics number 1, you could probably drop out of school and live off this comic for a while, because they're very valuable. And one of the things that's interesting about how valuable these comics are for Action Comic number 1 is that sometimes things are valuable because not very many of them were produced. That actually wasn't the case with this comic. DC sold hundreds of thousands of copies of Action Comics number 1. They did an initial run of 200,000 and wound up having to reprint more and more. The reason Action Comics number 1 is so rare is because these things were so disposable in the beginning. My daughter likes manga and anime, and sometimes we go to the comic book shop and get something, and when she buys something, they immediately get a plastic sleeve and start putting her comic in the plastic sleeve to preserve it and keep it. That's a relatively new thing, you know. Back in 1938, when this first emerged, you just read this thing, you wrinkled it up, you folded it up, you put it in your back pocket. Maybe you kept them. Maybe you were, OCD about these things and kept everything nice. But even if you did, at some point you grew out of these comics, and chances are, at some point, you or your mom threw out all these comic books. It's not that there weren't a lot of these Action Comics number 1 made. It's just so few of them were kept. Nobody thought of preserving these things. And so they just either fell apart, disintegrated, or you threw them away. Because comic books initially were sort of, supposed to be disposable junk. Yeah. And what's so intriguing about this comic book is part of the success had to do with what made so many middle-aged men running newspapers disinterested in Superman. He was so weird. He was so different. Imagine an 11-year-old kid walking by a newsstand filled with little books he or she could read, or other comic books, and other comic books that were, funnies, or maybe a comic book about cowboys. And then you see this. Some dude in primary colors wearing a cape, lifting a car over his head, smashed into something. Oh my God. I don't know what that is, but I want to read that. I want to know what that is. I gotta buy this thing. And so Superman was immediately successful. It was just one of those things that the people that didn't get it. But for those kids who saw it, were immediately drawn to this thing. They had to have it. And so Action Comics number 1 was immediately successful. Superman was a star right from the beginning. And I've sometimes compared Superman in the comics to Elvis Presley in rock and roll. Okay, Elvis Presley was not the first rock and roller. There were rock and rollers a few years before Elvis Presley. Bill Haley from Bill Haley and the Comets, for example, was a big rock and roll star before Elvis became famous. There were comics and comic book characters before Superman. There weren't superhero comic book characters, but there were comic book characters before Superman. But Superman was the first great star of the comic books. Like Elvis Presley, Superman created, showed the potential for success with comic books. Elvis convinced a lot of people in the music industry that rock and roll wasn't just some little fad that could be ignored. Elvis made a lot of people in the music industry take focus and realize, oh, this rock and roll is a real thing. Superman made a lot of people realize that comic books could be a really big thing, and particularly this new genre of the superhero could be a thing. All right. We could have an entire class, and I suspect, I've never really looked, but I suspect there might be an entire university course just on the character of Superman. You could easily do that. Well, I mean, maybe not easily. It would take a lot of work to put a class like that together, but you could totally do it. You would have plenty of material to create a class like that. Because one of the things that's interesting, not only of Superman, but of any sort of character that has lasted decades, is that a character like that is going to evolve and change and be reimagined. And so one of the things that's so fascinating about Superman is the character of Superman has evolved from Great Depression era Superman to post-World War II 1950s Superman to Superman at the late 1960s into the 1970s with the civil rights movement and the feminist movement and the anti-war movement to newer interpretations of Superman that we have today. Superman has changed as America has changed. And so one of the things Brad Wright tries to do is he tries to get us to understand what Superman was like in the late 30s into the 1940s, because that incarnation of Superman was quite different from some of the later ones, particularly for somebody of my generation. I'm around the same age as Brad Wright. The Superman that we grew up with in comic books, and particularly the 1950s television show that was very popular. When I was young, we didn't have cable TV. So you just had the television, the three big networks, and then local TV stations. And in every city in the United States, for my generation, when you came home from school, you could watch the old 1950s Superman show and then the 1960s Batman TV show. Superman was on at 3 o'clock. Batman was on at 3:30. They were half-hour shows. You could see them right when you came home from school. For generations. That Superman was the 1950s version of Superman. Quite a bit different from this earlier one. To get us to understand the original Superman, Wright tries to get us to understand another type of character from Great Depression era America, 1940s America, the hard-boiled detective. The hard-boiled detective was a kind of lone wolf private detective you got in noir fiction and noir movies. He was the loner. He was sort of the antisocial, sometimes almost anti-hero character that worked outside of the system. The hard-boiled detective, whether it was, like Mickey Spillane or other types of characters. He might have once been a police officer, but couldn't really stay working on the police force. Either it was too corrupt and that frustrated him, or he couldn't play by the rules. For example, he was too violent. And so, hold on a second. I'm going to pause this real quick because I got to plug in this computer. Sorry about that. I think the power strip I'm using stopped working. And so the hard-boiled detective goes out on his own and becomes a kind of lone wolf. Sort of bad attitude, mistrust the system. As we'll talk about, often has an issue with women. Brad Wright argues if we want to understand the first incarnation of Superman, the original Superman, we got to think of him like one of these hard-boiled detectives. He was a loner. He didn't really work with the system. If the system worked, you wouldn't need somebody like Superman. He was somewhat distrustful of women. Later incarnations of Superman, his relationship was very different with Lois Lane. That 1950s version of Superman, we'll talk about that later, fits with post-World War II American society. Superman almost has sort of like a puppy dog love for Lois Lane. He can't engage in it because he has this alternate life, but he has this sort of fawning for Lois Lane. The original Superman, he's attracted to Lois Lane, but she also kind of annoys him. You know, he has to keep saving her. She's too pushy. She's a reporter, and she's often doing things she shouldn't be doing because she's a woman. And Superman has to come and save her all the time, and that gets kind of annoying for him. And Superman, like the hard-boiled detective, doesn't want to get trapped by a woman. He doesn't want to get married and live behind a white picket fence. That world's not for him. So pay attention to Wright's discussion of comparing the original incarnation of Superman to the hard-boiled detective. Now, the context that we get Superman is still Great Depression era America. Now, by 1938, things are better. We talked about that in previous units. But the Great Depression's still going on. There's still a lot of people struggling. And the context of Superman was Superman was a hero to help the common man. Think of how much people were hurting during the Great Depression, how difficult things were for so many people. And then think of the idea of this overpowered alien who has good intentions in his heart, that wants to do things to make life better for people. Now, that would be an appealing idea at any time. But think of how appealing that would be, particularly during the Great Depression, where it seemed like the system wasn't working very well, where people weren't really looking out for you, where people were in need. And then think of how much the idea of Superman would resonate with people of that time. And so Wright argues that the very idea of the superhero fits with sort of the needs of Great Depression era America, a time where you needed something extra to help people out. Wright in that first chapter has a really interesting discussion of placing the superhero within a context of American heroes, a tradition. It's interesting. You know, by the time you get into the beginning of the 20th century, there weren't really any new heroes that matched the realities of 20th century America. What you got a lot of, even into the beginning of the 20th century, is a lot of frontier hero types, cowboy style heroes that really matched the 19th century. And Wright argues that you need to understand the superhero as a kind of 20th century adaptation for a new modern hero. Think of Superman. Superman was modern for the 20th century. Where did he live? He lived in the big city. He lived in Metropolis, which was clearly supposed to be New York City. Right? He lived in the big city. He lived a modern life. He had a modern job for that time. He was a journalist. He wasn't some cowboy riding the range on a horse, you know, living in the Badlands of the Dakotas or the Arizona desert. Superman was modern. It was a new interpretation. pay attention to Brad Wright's discussion of the idea of the superhero as an updating of the idea of what the American hero should be for the 20th century. Well, as with so many other aspects of popular culture, when one formula becomes popular, Superman and the superhero, others try to tweak and play with that formula to tap in on that success. And no other comic book publisher was aware of the success of this formula more than DC Comics itself. Who understood this better than DC, who saw the money rolling in for Superman? So DC started to tweak this formula of taking the idea of the superhero. So an individual with alternate identity, for some of the time he was a normal person, or as we'll talk about in a little while, she was a normal person. But then later they would don an outfit, sometimes with a cape, and assume a different identity and use powers that they have to fight crime and to help normal people. And so the superhero becomes a whole genre of comic book characters that initially on were the most popular of the comic books. After Superman, we get Batman. And Batman was an interesting twist on, let's take many of the things that are popular with Superman, but tweak it and find some differences. One of the most compelling things about Batman is, strictly speaking, Batman does not have superpowers. Unless you call being super rich a superpower, which, especially in some of the more modern interpretations of Batman, it almost seems like money is a superpower, because it seems like Batman, because of his enormous wealth, can get some things everybody else can't get. But nonetheless, the fact that Batman doesn't, strictly speaking, have any superpowers has always been one of the things that makes him so compelling as a character. If there is a fatal flaw with Superman, was that Superman has always been overpowered. Just from the beginning, he's overpowered. Every Superman story has to come around to the idea of getting kryptonite. The one thing that Superman is vulnerable to is kryptonite. So often when the bad guys want to try to do something to kill Superman, it's simply a matter of, we need to get some kryptonite, which really limits the storytelling of what you can do. Superman's just too damn strong, and that makes it a problem in telling stories. But Batman is fully mortal. He can be killed. He can die. So there's an intriguing vulnerability to Batman, which frankly accounts for why you often have more interesting stories with Batman. You could just do more with Batman. So that was a really interesting twist. How can we have a superhero that, technically speaking, doesn't have superpowers? Another interesting thing, another interesting twist on Batman, is if you think of the first incarnation of Superman as being similar to the hard-boiled detective in other kinds of noir literature and noir movies from the 1930s and 40s, think of Batman in terms of taking two genres that were popular in books and movies of that time also. Horror movies, horror storytelling in Pulp Fiction or Penny Dreadfuls, and gangster stories. With Prohibition that we talked about before in the 1920s, one of the things Prohibition did, the banning of alcohol, was it created a massive market for illegal alcohol. And so organized crime rises up to fill the demand of tens of millions of Americans who still wanted to drink alcohol during the Great Depression. You will sometimes hear that Prohibition created organized crime. Well, I mean, it greatly expanded organized crime. There was organized crime before Prohibition, but it really expanded because there was now this incredibly profitable thing you could sell if you were willing to break the law to do it. And so you get this tremendous growth of organized crime. And so the gangster story in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s becomes more popular. And if you think about Batman, on the one hand, there is this horror element to Batman. Batman himself is very goth with the whole bat thing. But the villains he fights are often monstrous. There is a kind of horror quality to the Batman storytelling. And then there's also a gangster element, because Batman is often with himself or later on with his ally Robin, fighting against not simply a lone villain, but their crew, right? The Joker always had a set. The Penguin had his crew. The Joker had his crew. The Riddler had his crew. So there was this very intentional idea behind Batman to combine elements that were popular in other areas of popular culture, horror and the gangster story, and put it together. And then one final thing worth talking about that made the Batman comics intriguing was the dark, pessimistic vision of society that we get in the Batman comics. There was something bleak and dystopian about Batman's world. And again, Brad Wright tries to fit this within the context of Great Depression era America. The system didn't seem like it worked. Local political leaders didn't seem like they were doing their jobs. Law enforcement seemed corrupt. Courts weren't doing their job. Things were broken. Well, if you go to the Gotham that Batman comes from, Gotham was this very dysfunctional city. It was dystopia. Dystopia is the opposite of utopia. If a utopia is a perfect society, a dystopia is a completely malfunctioning society. Batman's world is twisted and bleak and dystopian. And Batman is just doing his best to try and change that as much as he can. And so again, pay attention when Wright is talking about these comic books and these characters and how they reflect aspects of what was going on in the society. So some of that bleak dystopian nature that we find in the early Batman comics comes from the period of time that these comics were created in Great Depression era America. Again, as time evolves, Batman's going to change. We'll talk about when we get to post-World War II American society, when we get to the 1950s where things were more optimistic, we're going to see the vision of American society reflected in the Batman comics is going to be much more optimistic than the earlier vision. All right, let's talk about one more of these superheroes, and that was Wonder Woman. Again, same idea. Let's try and take this new popular superhero formula and let's try and tweak it. Let's try and do something a little different. Now, the big idea with Wonder Woman was a female superhero. Now, part of the idea of this was that comic books were being read more by boys than they were being read by girls. And so the idea of Wonder Woman was a female superhero might get more girls interested into reading superhero comics. All right. And so we get Wonder Woman. Okay. Wonder Woman was this really groundbreaking character, this really strong, powerful woman that could fight crime and protect protect Americans. And so, in that sense, Wonder Woman has always been this feminist icon. She has been this step in the right direction. However, there were always some interesting limitations early on to just how powerful a female superhero could be. One of the things Wonder Woman didn't do early in the comics was she didn't save men. Yes, she was strong. Yes, she was powerful. But the idea of physically saving men from harm, the people at DC, and again, once again, Wonder Woman was a DC comic. The idea of Wonder Woman saving a man would invert traditional gender roles a bit too much, they thought. Traditionally speaking, it was supposed to be the man's job to save the woman. It's the white knight that saves the damsel in distress. It's the hero that saves the young woman tied up and laid on the railroad tracks and brings her to safety. It's the man's job to do those things. And so Wonder Woman could be powerful. She could be strong. But in the early comics, she never saved men. You were never going to see a Wonder Woman comic where there's a house on fire and Wonder Woman runs in there and has a man thrown over her shoulder and brings him out to safety, because DC thought that would be too much. That would be too controversial. America wasn't ready for that. So instead, Wonder Woman saved other women and children. She'd go into that burning house and save the wife, the mother, the children. She'd save a boy. The sons and the daughters in the house. She could do that. But it would be too much if she saved men. So there was that limitation to her. There's also the issue of how Wonder Woman appeared and how she looked. This was going to be an issue we'll talk about throughout this unit, about representations of women in comic books. Women tended to be depicted in highly sexualized ways. Long legs, large bust lines, tiny little waist, scantily clad clothing. So come on, think of it. She's wearing a strapless top. She's out fighting crime with the strapless top. How's that going to be effective? She's wearing short shorts. Like, if you were going to put together an outfit to go and fight crime in any sort of rational way, this is not what you would be wearing. But because she's a female character, she got depicted in these sort of scantily clad ways. Again, this was done intentionally because as much as DC Comics wanted to go after that female readership, get more girls reading superhero comics, they also wanted to keep the boys coming to the yard. And dressing Wonder Woman up with a strapless top and short shorts and then later on go-go boots was a way to get the boys to keep coming. Right? And then you have, and again, we'll talk about this, and Wright in your book talks about this, all kinds of really strange sex stuff when it comes to comic books in general, but also Wonder Woman. I mean, look, one of her superpowers was her lasso of truth, which she could wield both as a weapon, but also to secure particularly men, in which men would be tied up. And because the lasso of truth forced men to tell the truth, it basically forced men to do what Wonder Woman wanted them to do. So let's put all this together. You have this smoke show of a woman wearing scantily clad clothing who ties men up and makes them submit to her will. Don't we have another word for a woman like that? She's a dominatrix. Wonder Woman is a dominatrix. Um, and by the way, we know this from the creator of Wonder Woman. Like he had, we know now, these sexual fetishes personally. He believed that men like to be dominated by strong women and tied up by strong women. So this isn't some weird theory that people have cooked up. Like, just read the Wonder Woman comics. It's all there before your eyes, right? And so you have that, and so there's Wonder Woman was this great character, and on one level, yes, a feminist icon, and very much a step in the right direction. But on the other hand, there's these problematic things about Wonder Woman that help us understand the time. Like Wonder Woman emerges the very beginning of the 1940s, right? And she is partly a reflection of those times. She was a step in the right direction, trying to move America in some ways beyond traditional representations of women, and that's a good thing. But there were limits to how far in 1940s America representations of women could go. And we see that with Wonder Woman. All right. Okay, that's enough for this lecture. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.